old and you can't even drive? I can. Are you stupid, eh? Are you a stupid fool? Well, why can't you drive then? You can't even drive. A bit grey today, isn't it?
All right, hello everyone, and welcome to another Deepest Law. Thanks for joining us. I am here with Mike from Imperium. How you doing, Mike?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on.
And Alexander Adams. Welcome to the show, sir.
Well, as one AA to another AA, greetings.
Yeah, now you've been on before, I think. Have you been on Deepest Law? I'm sure you have. You must have been.
Yes,
before.
I did a stream with Pharaoh, and we looked at whether or not the right wing was sort of artistically avant-garde or traditional, and the sort of the problems of representational art for a vanguard.
Yes, that was right. Just before we get going here, I'll just remind people I've got to keep the lights on and pay the bill. So do buy courses at the academic agency. Buy it now, especially the Trivium, which is probably the most popular of all the courses. But all of the courses are worth getting, including Pharaoh's Foundations of Entrepreneurship, among others. All three of the gentlemen on this stream are entrepreneurs of a sort, I would have thought. But Mike, anything you would like to promote, sir?
I'll just say that given what we're about to speak about tonight, which is culture broadly, that anybody who likes what you hear, go check out the Culture Dads podcast. If you go to imperiumpress.org, click podcasts at the top, and you'll find it. And yeah, it's good. I think you'll enjoy it.
Yeah, I certainly I enjoy listening to Culture Dads, although as with all of my listening, I'm weeks, months behind even. So, I just listened to your hip hop one, which you must have done probably back in October or something, right? But I'm slowly
just doubled our output, so yeah, you're gonna get further behind as time goes on.
Slowly catching up with all my buddies after I'm coming out of the fog of writing of book writing. Speaking of book writing, Alexander Adams is an author, of course. He has many books, but anything you would like to promote?
Yes, well, you can find my books on book-selling websites. You can also find them on Bournebrook Mag. They have a site where they sell my books. You can also find my articles on Lotus Eaters, and have to show my Substack, which is alexanderadamsart.substack.com. Please subscribe for free content. If you subscribe as a paid subscriber, that is extra helpful. If you want to go to linktree/alexanderadamsart, you can find other ways to follow and support me.
Right, and so what we're gathered to talk about today, you can see in the topic, is modern art left wing. And I mean, this is kind of a little bit, this meme has been doing around. You can't be punk and also be racist, sexist, homophobic, or transphobic. It's impossible, right? That's the kind of modern, this is the very current iteration of this, but I think there's a tendency sometimes in our circles to think of quote unquote modern art, that is anything that doesn't look like a kind of I feel like they'll stretch as far as Monet or something, right? Right, they'll go as far as that, but anything after the late 19th century becomes quote unquote modern art. The person who immediately springs to mind is Paul Joseph Watson, right? And as I was saying before the stream, I always think that's quite interesting because it was PJW who coined the phrase "conservatism is the new counterculture," and he likes he venerates Morrissey and various other characters like that. He never puts two and two together. He never then thinks to look back at previous eras and figure out, like, hold on, not all of these quote unquote modern artists were left-wing subversives trying to like destroy beauty or whatever. But he's got this very set idea that all modern art is a kind of leftist subversion of the eternal truth of beauty. I don't actually know where this comes from. I vaguely want to point at Roger Scruton, but Alexander Adams, you probably know more. Like, where does this idea come from, and how did it get into like right-wing circles that modern art is like always left-wing and bad?
Well, it's partly an outgrowth of conservative responses against modernism, which of course means if you're a leftist, that means you're automatically siding with modernism because you've already got your enemies arrayed against you. So you've got, the established. Well, originally you had the establishment and the church, and you had the academies against you. But of course now they've all been subverted. So of course they're all on board, and modernist art was always a conservative value. I think you'll find now. So you have various people railing against it. You have a lot of people saying, well, this is unpicking stability, and of course that's what the champions said. That's what they were saying about Cubism. All of the flattened planes, the denial of perspective, which you get in Picasso and Braque and so forth, picked up by the futurists, who I think we're going to mention quite soon. That this was seen as a refutation of an old system. And so you have like the old system of perspective is aligned with the old system of morality, the old system of the church, the old system of, sending the lads out to die in the trenches, that it was sort of all affiliated. So you had a connection of the old ways of doing things being seen as morally reprehensible and morally bankrupt. So therefore, modernism was an alternative. But as we'll see, modernism was taken up by reactionary figures. There are champions who are reactionary.
No. Just before we continue with this, I mean, I don't like credentialism, as people know, but on this topic, maybe it's worth kind of outlining briefly, like, why should people listen to you on this topic? I mean, I'll just say briefly for myself is that I don't really mention it very often, but I did do my master's degree on 20th century lit and specifically modernism. I wrote my dissertation on W.B. Yeats, Beckett. I did a project on T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound. I've got that annotated copy of the Wasteland somewhere here. So I mean, I do know a fair old bit about modernism, mainly through doing that course. And then I actually did something quite rare in academia, which is I switched periods in my PhD. I became a Shakespearean, but I was always masquerading as a Shakespearean, if that makes any sense. I was never like I was a theorist who just needed a hook, essentially, which is what, and in literary studies, how can I put it? Like, Shakespeare's the arena that you do that sort of stuff in, right? And then it filters down to the rest of the discipline. The only kind of subcategory of literary studies that does not hold true for, funny enough, is deconstruction, which came out of the Romantics. Like, the Romantics always own deconstruction. Paul de Man, you may have heard of, and deconstruction could never really get going within Shakespeare studies. But many people would argue that's kind of why it died a death as well. Kind of got like absorbed, and nobody really does that stuff anymore. Kind of late 70s Yale school stuff. But anyway, that is kind of my, I mean, as far as credentials go, that is what I know about this topic. But Alexander Adams, what do you know about this? Why should
what do I know? Well, I'm a working artist. I trained as an artist. I also studied history of art at the University of London. I've written 3 books on artists. I've written about 5, it depends how you count them, sort of 5 or 6 separate books on culture, and a lot of those deal with the importance of modernism, the conflict between modernism and postmodernism. I've written over 1,000 articles on art history, their art reviews, opinion pieces, polemics, studies of aesthetics, and also I've written quite a lot on literature as well. So Pound, Beckett, Eliot, and many others. So I do have a foot in both literature and fine art.
And Mike, I'm now, am I remembering this correctly, Mike? That before running Imperium Press, you were involved in the music industry in some way. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. I was a working musician for many years, and then later I transitioned towards working as a music producer and audio engineer. So I have a bit of insight into the technical background, as well as the the history of music and everything. And I eventually found my way into, sort of by way of going from being a musician to being like a technician supporting the music industry, I found my way into the history of like the craft of audio engineering, and the development of like electronics engineering as it regarded the audio industry. And that led me back to things like the Italian futurists, who basically started with the art of noises. We'll get into all of that, but yeah, basically this led me towards. I mean, I was always part of like the punk and metal scene in the city I was living in, so I really got very heavy into sort of like avant-garde and weird stuff, especially very challenging music, noisy music. And when I became an audio engineer, I started a very avant-garde noise music project with a few other audio engineers, where we basically abused audio equipment in ways that was never meant to do. And I've always also been very much into classical music, especially the Romantic era, and that led me on into the 20th century and into the sort of like more modernist era, like via Stravinsky into the Second Viennese School, and on into composers like Ligeti and Penderecki and all these wonderful modern composers that I find to be absolutely vital and very interesting. And there's a lot of crossover, as we'll talk about with that. So my background is I know a fair bit more about the history of modernist music, but I also, by way of being a publisher, am familiar with the modernist literary scene as well. I'm much less familiar with visual arts, but yeah, it's very interesting as well. And I certainly have my favorites in that regard. And I absolutely love modernist aesthetics. And I actually wrote an article on my Substack that it was just in defense of, I think it was called In Defense of Modernist Aesthetics, against the sort of rising tide of just reactive traditionalism, maybe you could say, in our scene. I certainly love Bach and classical art and everything like that, but it's not the only thing. And there's a native expression of our folk soul, or the European folk group, that is expressed in modernism, and I think that that's worth defending as well.
So I mean, just into, I don't know if you want to start like now and move backwards, or start at the quote unquote beginning, but by which I mean 19th century. I'm like not going back to like the birth of the West or anything like that. We have to pick a starting point. But it seems to me that if I was to tell a very short, what I'll do is I'll tell my own short story version of it, and then you guys can kind of either correct me or add meat to the bones, right? And I'm going on what I can remember myself from those projects I mentioned. I mean, we're talking like 20 years ago now, when I was a graduate. But what I remember is that there was obviously the Romantic movement, capital R Romantic, which in literature, in English is Wordsworth, Coleridge, and then you've got like Byron, Shelley, Keats, and William Blake as well, who were tapping into a vein of, broadly speaking, like German idealist thought. So, Goethe. There's a bit of crossover here with Carlyle, who comes a bit later on as well, who was a kind of English exponent of German idealism. And this is like a strain running through 19th century literature, the first half of the 19th century. And then later on, just skipping forward past the Victorians a moment, you have this moment where W.B. Yeats, who's not someone whose name is always brought up in this context, but in my mind, he is the crossover, the godfather, if you want, of what I think of as literary modernism. Almost in the way, I mean, this will be an imperfect analogy, but like people talk about like Iggy Pop and his relationship with punk or something like that. It was like, well, I don't know, but W.B. Yeats at one point in his career was trying to find an authentic vernacular to write a kind of Irish national. He was an Irish nationalist, and he was trying to find an authentic vernacular to write in English a kind of something authentically Irish, if that makes any sense. And so there were these deep, like, romantic strains in Yeats. But then at some point during that whole process, it starts like spilling over, and like modernity starts like creeping in, and his attempts to remain a romantic get, I don't know, like thwarted in some way, and you get this almost like new language that comes about, and in some ways, I mean, I see what Eliot and Pound were doing really as then a continuation of the sort of that turn in Yeats, if that makes any sense, where it's like they have an awareness of the heavy hand of history on their shoulder. T.S. Eliot has an amazing essay where he talks about the influence. How is it that when you sit down, you can literally feel the weight of Shakespeare and all these different writers hovering over your shoulder. So there's this kind of strange modern awareness of the past, and they knew that even though they wanted to recapture some sort of like spirit of the past, they couldn't really do it without inventing a new language. And then at the same time, they wanted to, how can I put this? They wanted to register the actual experience, the decentering alien experience of living in quote unquote modernity. I'm thinking of like J. Alfred Prufrock or something like that. So you get all these things, like those two things are almost at the one hand, there is this capital R romantic impetus of trying to find a vernacular to express something inherited, right? But at the same time, there is I guess the way I'd phrase it now is like coming to terms with being the children of the winter, and how do you express what it feels like to be that? And these two things, I think, combine to make something approaching modernism. So, okay, I don't know who wants to go first, but Alexander Adams, how much?
Actually, I will nip in there and actually do a promo for a cigar stream that we did with Evelyn on Wyndham Lewis. Because if you go to the beginning of that stream, there's a little section on the men of 1914 who are Pound, Eliot, Yeats, Joyce, and T.E. Hume, who died during the war. And that's quite a good summary in a sort of like a 20-minute discussion of these group of sort of radical men who came to the fore in 1914 and were intimately involved in the sort of this rise of modernism, but also drawing very deeply from tradition. They weren't as anti-traditional as, say, the futurists, for example, who we're going to look at in a minute.
Yes, what's that line? Change utterly, a terrible beauty is born. I mean, that's I think it's from Easter 1916. Yeah, I mean, Mike, how much of what I just outlined do you recognize, and how much what would you add to it? I guess.
Right. So I think it's good to sort of locate modernism in the trajectory related to Romanticism, and not just because the one kind of succeeded the other, but because they are intimately related. I think also, maybe before we go too far, it's worth, because we're going to talk a lot about modernism and Romanticism and these topics. It's worth saying at least a word about, if we're going to equate modernism with the right wing, or to tie them together, I think we should talk a little bit about what's meant by the right wing, even though, that may seem obvious. I don't think it is, actually. And I think it would be good to clarify that. So, I mean, if by, let's just say, left wing, we mean against the status quo, which is kind of generally what the mainstream discourse kind of talks about. This basically forecloses on any possibility of the radical right, which we obviously know is kind of nonsense. So we need to go a little deeper. If by left we mean against tradition, then modernism was a left-wing movement. But I think this is a pretty impoverished sense of the term. It puts too many things in the left-wing camp that don't belong there. Among them, nationalism. And I think a more robust and useful framework is to see the left in terms of being fundamentally entropic. The left means basically breaking down barriers. It means transcending boundaries, freedom, basically. And this understanding, I think, has the advantage of agreeing with the liberal tradition, such as it is, where when Kant, in his essay, What is Enlightenment, he says, in a word, it's freedom. So we have to understand the Enlightenment, from revolutionary liberalism to the Enlightenment and on into Romanticism and modernism. Basically, the Enlightenment is a left-wing movement. It emphasizes transcending boundaries with its universalism and abstraction and reason transcending nature. But Romanticism, on the other hand, I would characterize that as broadly a right-wing movement, in that it emphasizes particularism, concreteness, and the immanence of the natural world. And modernism, I believe, continues this right-wing move by essentially leaning into all of these, especially in that modernism accepts, man's thrownness into the harsh reality of the industrial revolution and whatnot. But modernism, it's not just a continuation of Romanticism. There's actually, as I guess is obvious, there's something radically new here. Romanticism rejects the sterility of the Enlightenment. It kind of wants to return, to a superior aboriginal state. Usually it's bound up with nationality and whatnot. But the watchword of Romanticism is authenticity. But unlike Romanticism, modernism doesn't try to escape or flee from the ugliness and brutality of the world. It actually tries to hold this brutality up and look it square in the face. So Romanticism and modernism both feel like we've lost something, and I think that they both lament that loss. But modernism is kind of like the black-pilled version of Romanticism, right?
Yeah. No, I mentioned, obviously people know I've just finished writing this book, The Prophets of Doom. One thing I didn't know, came up in the research essentially, was that these figures that we mentioned have a fair bit of crossover with some of those authors I look at in Prophets of Doom. For example, Vico, who Greg Johnson has called, our Karl Marx type thing. in a very important counter-Enlightenment philosopher, was essentially forgotten to the mists of time until James Joyce really got into him. And James Joyce is more or less single-handedly responsible for bringing Vico kind of back into the canon, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
A ton of Vico scholarship is actually in Joyce studies, which I just didn't know about. Also, there was when I was researching Spengler, there were a ton of like Spenglerian readings of Eliot's The Wasteland, for example. You know, because it's all about the seasons and it's cyclic, and they entertain notions of cyclical time. And then, even though he's a little bit later on, if you the plays of Samuel Beckett, in a strange way, are like curiously anti-progressive in the way they process time. There's never any progress in Beckett. I always remember this play, Act Without Words, where this guy is literally thrown on stage, and then he tries to escape the stage, and he's flung back on the stage, and then he tries to do something or build something, and everything comes to shit basically in Beckett. Like there's no progress ever in Beckett.
That's very true in the novels, in the sort of Murphy Malone and also Krapp's Last Tape, where the sort of the past and the past loses its linearity. It becomes like a stasis.
Yeah, absolutely. And I found some like amazing. I forget the name of the writer now, but I found this amazing like Irish dude ranting on Spengler and Toynbee. It's just like I mean, he was written in the 1930s, but he was like he was like saying, what are these newfangled ideas coming in from the continent type thing. And he was lamenting the fact that kind of trendy cafe types were into Spengler, essentially, from a kind of just like, very I guess like reactionary Catholic point of view in a strange way, where these where Spengler and them were perceived as modern in some way, which seems odd to us now. So these are dynamics that are somewhat lost when we try to fit everything into quote unquote left and right, Because I don't think anybody would think of somebody like Spengler as being left wing. Yet, in the context of 1930s Ireland, he was seen as being a kind of subversive continental influence to that order, if it makes any sense.
Well, because he was non-Christian, he was non-Catholic. So
exactly. So I realize the literary figures have been dominating proceedings so far. Does it really start with those guys that we were talking about? What's happening in the visual arts at the same time, Alexander?
Well, before we get on to that, I think it's worth mentioning, it's very interesting about what you said about crossing boundaries. I think that the cross-disciplinary movement in academia is one of the most poisonous things, because what it means is that no one is an expert on anything anymore, because you can have people who straddle disciplines and can bring in their own nonsense out of nowhere, and they can't be challenged because they're not in an established field. I mean, obviously nonsense spreads in every field, whether it's established or not, but I think the cross-disciplinary studies and cross-disciplinary work in art is a seeding ground for all sorts of malarkey, shall we say. And I've just written an article on the aesthetics of Nietzsche, which you can find on my Substack channel article. And that's basically, Nietzsche was complaining that he saw a flaw in a lot of the art of his time, in that it lacked purity. You had novelists who were trying to convey painterly effects in words. And so he was quite frustrated. He thought that you should be using your discipline more in a more narrow scope. And anyway, I discussed that a little bit in the article. So it's interesting that Nietzsche seems to have noticed that, even though he wasn't terribly big on the visual arts.
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of, because obviously we've got the literary figures, we've got the visual arts, and we've got the music. I mean, one of the figures who crops up in Prophets of Doom, I have a chapter on Gobineau in there, and Gobineau heavily influenced Wagner. Right now, Mike, in the overall scheme, I can imagine Wagner has a lot of nationalist fans, right, for various reasons. But in the overall scheme of things, how do you categorize him? Is he a very late romantic? Is he a modernist, or is he something quite different again?
Well, I mean, Wagner, he is in some ways a liminal figure. I see him more in the romantic nationalist camp. He obviously underwent an evolution, as artists do, but it's really the break with tonality that starts to move things toward modernism happens for him in the overture to Tristan and Isolde, which is a wonderful piece of music that everyone should go listen to right now, or at least after the stream, because it really does sort of dislocate the tonal center in a way that really hadn't happened before. It was kind of a scandal when this came out. Actually, Nietzsche writes about this very penetratingly. So Wagner really starts to move things kind of, I mean, this is something that had been happening for a long time. Basically, Romanticism had already started to experiment very, very deeply with like chromaticism and lacking tonality and key and whatnot. And basically, what Wagner, if you could say he's the one that starts it, maybe like there are arguments that others had done it before, but if you could see what he starts, is an evolution that moves through folks like Debussy and Eric Satie, getting towards the sort of like into the fin de siècle era, sort of the late 19th century. And then you get into the early 20th century and you get figures like Stravinsky, who sort of further push that along. And obviously he's immensely brilliant. And it really sort of reaches a fever pitch with the second Viennese school, which is Arnold Schoenberg, Alban Berg, and Anton Webern. And it's the total break with tonality comes with the 12-tone system, which is a very interesting, I don't know what you could call it. It's almost like an algorithmic framework for composition that guarantees that there is going to be no tonal center. And here we get into something that's utterly modern. Meanwhile, there are other currents sort of moving along, political currents that are carrying aesthetics along. I'm thinking specifically of the Italian futurists, who were not just a musical movement, but they were also, there's literary figures and philosophical figures and everything like that. But they were obviously, as a futurist movement, very concerned with creating something new, breaking with the old. And again, this sounds like a left-wing sort of thing, but if you can see it in the context, rather than like, pro or anti-tradition, I think it's more looking at it in terms of pro or anti-enlightenment. The futurists can be considered somewhat of a right-wing force, in that they're very much holding up the speed and violence of the modern world and trying to find some sort of catharsis in that. So this is an important development in music, because you get basically the I'm spacing on the guy's last name, but it's Luigi something or other. Maybe one of you guys can bail me out here. He creates what's called the art of noises, where he's basically taking electronic equipment, like very primitive electronic equipment by today's standards, and like speakers and microphones and things, and creating feedback loops and doing like bizarre audio experiments with this. Would be in about, I think, the 1920s or something like that. And it's sort of like a precursor to the electronic music. Basically, this is sort of the big bang of electronic music, but it's all bound up with this aesthetic of futurism and moving, essentially embracing the Industrial Revolution on an aesthetic level. So
It's,
I mean,
it's Russolo, right?
yeah,
Luigi.
Russolo, that's right. Yeah, Luigi Russolo, you got it. So I mean, whereas Romanticism is kind of like an attempt at restoration, like what Wagner, at least early Wagner, is trying to do, is to harken back to the mythical past of the Germanic peoples. What modernism is kind of trying to do is it's an acceleration. Basically, it's continuing the same. It's like a continuation of Romanticism by other means, I guess. It kind of continues the same basic project, but it sort of leans into the break that the Enlightenment has sort of thrust upon us, whereas Romanticism is kind of trying to restore. It's trying to go back a little bit, so it's a bit reactionary.
Yeah, no, I mean, I mentioned Spengler. This is something people don't often understand about him, right? You know, when he says optimism is cowardice, right? In Man and Technics, Spengler essentially argues that you have to kind of like, we cannot go back. You can't, the children of winter can't be the children of the summer, right?
Yeah.
So you have to kind of embrace the techniques. Essentially, you have to, there's no way out of it. You have to go through it, if that makes any sense. So I can see a little bit of this kind of thinking in what you've been describing. Just before I bring Alexander in, there's another axis here, because you've mentioned traditionalism versus modernity, or enlightenment versus counter-enlightenment values. There's also the elite kind of plebeian split, which is something that Dee has often talked about on this show. I'm guessing that Italian futurism, I mean, was that a movement for the mass man, Mike, or was it an elite thing for elite circles?
It's not really. It wasn't really a populist movement sort of thing. There's an interesting dynamic that's going on around this time, right around like World War One, sort of maybe slightly post World War One, because you know what modernism and romanticism shared, even with the Enlightenment, is the rejection of a kind of corrupt old order. So at this time, you get like post World War One intellectuals and like futurists and modernist artists and right wing vanguards, political vanguards, basically all sharing a contempt for bourgeois respectability. All of these people, including the futurists, had been outside like the class system, like the national system of, you know, traditionally respectable European society, even before that system broke down. And eventually the breakdown of that system kind of gives way to this anarchic despair, and produces a kind of contempt for respectability and like normal life and normies, I guess we would say today. There was kind of like this violent dissatisfaction with that world. It's kind of embodied.
This is very strong in another one of the writers I talk about in Prophets of Doom, which is Evola, of course.
Yeah.
He was, I mean, this sort of stuff was happening when he was young, and he shares that absolute contempt for bourgeois normie, essentially.
Yes, and he was noted as one of the most significant proponents of Dadaism in Italy. Dadaism was the sort of the anti-art movement, the anti-bourgeois, the anti-academy art movement. Well, it wasn't an art movement, it was an anti-art movement that arose in the Second World War, mainly in Switzerland. A little bit of it going on in New York as well. So that's Duchamp and Picabia and Tristan Tzara and some of these people who went into the Surrealists in the 1920s. Yeah, so the futurists, as I understand it, I mean, I would see them as a counter. They are elitist. They are absolutely elitist. I was recently listening to Jonathan Bowden. I'm going to be writing an essay on Jonathan Bowden for my Substack. So pimping out my Substack again. And he said that he saw Vorticism as the only native national art movement that Britain ever produced. I think that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but he's got a fair point there. And Vorticism actually came out of an earlier movement, which is futurism. And futurists were radical counter-elite. So they were absolute snobs, but they were not the academy, they were not the establishment. They genuinely were revolutionary, and they were actually advocating quite astonishing things. So I'll read a couple of things from their manifesto. Might be a good time to put some images up.
Okay, yes. Which who do you want to pull up?
Yeah, if you just bring up the first of the futurists, and we'll just work through
Fantastic.
them.
This is Saravini. So let's have a look at him. There he is.
Yeah. So this is Gino Severini at the Marlborough Gallery in 1913 at an opening of an exhibition. I think we've seen some characters like this turning up to events, haven't we?
Yeah, average event attender. Yeah.
Average AA listener. A picture here.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
So the futurists would hold these exhibitions, which were quite radical. They were based on flat art, abstraction, movement. So they say in one of the manifestos, they say, we intend to glorify the love of danger, the custom of energy, the strength of daring. They want also to promote the essential elements of our poetry will be courage, audacity, and revolt. They also go on to point 4. We declare that the splendor of the world has been encircled with a new form of beauty, the beauty of speed. The race automobile adorned with great pipes like serpents with explosive breath. A race automobile which seems to rush over exploding powder is more beautiful than the victory of Samothrace, which is a famous Hellenistic sculpture which is housed in the Louvre. So they were saying essentially, we're into speed, we're into movement, we're into energy, we're into mechanical things, we're into straight lines, we're also into curves because that's to do with movement as well. And so they were actually advocating things like burning down the libraries, flooding the museums, using a Rembrandt as an ironing board, and so forth.
Right. So, I mean, in terms of the visual art, Alexander, obviously we've started in the middle of futurism here, but is there like a pre-futurist modernism in the visual arts in your view?
Yes. Futurism is essentially a continuation of Cubism, which originated in 1907 with Picasso and Braque. So Picasso and Braque were looking a lot at the late Cézanne, a big Cézanne exhibition on in London at the moment, who was very interested in geometry and flattened forms and planes. And so they took this a bit further, and they started doing geometrical shapes, absolute planar systems. They acted as though perspective was an illusion, that it was artificial. And so they started using collage. So they would cut out bits of newspaper and stick that onto the surface of a picture, and then they would do a drawing around it. So that was a radical way of turning the still life and even the figure into something that was very flat and anti-Western. So they were sort of looking at like sort of Chinese perspective and so forth.
Right. Now, what would you say to the people in the audience who would say, well, all of that sounds rather transgressive, Alexander? All that sounds quite left wing and subversive, not like, you know, to come back to the topic of the stream, like how is what you just described part of the forces of the quote unquote right?
I didn't start with Cubism because I thought, well, it really isn't terribly right wing. What you've got is the futurists who come up in sort of 1909, 1910. They come up with this radical manifesto, and this is not just going beyond saying, oh, we want flat surfaces, we want to deny perspective, we want to remove pictorial depth. What we're going to do is we are going to destroy what came before. We are going to erase it because it is bourgeois, because it is contaminated. It needs a new feeling of energy, of movement, of modernity. We are going to abolish the old systems. We're going to abolish the nymphs and the gods of the paintings that you've seen before. We are going to put in dancers and motor racers and cyclists and so forth. And we're going to put in modern things. And this is going to be done in a modern way. And it's going to be in some ways, some of them go into the sort of the scientific area. So you get a group called the Orphists, who were trying to do this in a sort of scientific way, and the Purists, who are trying to do this in a slightly decorative way. But the Futurists are the purest form of right-wing vanguard radicalism.
Right, and this is, I mean, I guess the key thing to grasp here. I mean, you mentioned Bowden, we've mentioned Nietzsche, I mentioned Carlyle earlier on. I mean, all of these are figures who would belong to the quote unquote radical right, as opposed to conservatism, right?
Yes, they're anti-conservative. Yes,
they're anti-conservative. They want, clear them out. We need a new start.
Yes.
I mean, this is the kind of, or, it's Carlyle basically in the French Revolution saying, to be honest, they fucking deserved it.
Yeah.
It was a rotten order. And yeah, so this is a little bit difficult to get your head around if you've got this kind of ever notion of conservatives just being people who want to preserve what's ever there, right? Whereas the radical right wants to, in a way, remake society according to its ideals, according to its...
and one of the points of the manifesto, I'll read you point 9, we will glorify war, the only true hygiene of the world, militarism, patriotism, the destructive gesture of anarchism, the anarchist, the beautiful ideas which kill, and the scorn of woman.
I mean, another way of phrasing this. I'm just thinking of some of these writers I've just been considering. A reoccurring phrase is, I think it's something that Bronze Age Pervert has said quite a bit as well, which is that the bourgeois world is a world which flattens, right? It leads to the Enlightenment ideas and kind of bourgeois universalism. They lead to this kind of deadening reign of quantity, I guess, right? Which is a war on all that is qualitative. It is a war on distinction. It is a war on the exceptional man, right? So in a strange way, this is like a celebration of that spirit that leads to distinction, right? Which is somewhat different from the kind of bourgeois conservative ideal of, I basically call it Hank Hillism, right? It's the 2.4 family, the Hank Hill with a grill, everybody needs to have a respectable job and a respectable wife and a respectable member of the community and all this sort. This is a rather different trajectory of thought. And at the moment, I still see these two forces in a strange way sitting uneasily side by side in what is called the quote unquote right, because of course the left as it stands today and as it stands back then, it almost stands against both of those things for different reasons, right? Because the left is also utilitarian, the left also has a war on distinction, but the left also, for its own reasons, has a distaste for the 2.4 family and all the rest of it. So,
but also interestingly, you've got rampant materialism on both sides, both the bourgeois side and the sort of the vanguard rightist side, because they want a new world made with metal, they want it with machines, they want things done efficiently, they want to do away with the old fusty things, they want to do with the traditions, the ties to land and so forth. So in a way you can see, well, this is also radically materialist as well. It's not spiritual, it's not perennial.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so shall I share a few more of these? I mean, should we have a look at Saravini? See if I can.
Severini. Yeah.
I'll just pull up one of his works here.
So this is a painting that's let's get up the details. So this is a 1912 painting, dynamic hieroglyphic of the Bal Tabarin. So this is like a dance hall. So they're painting modern scenes in a modern way. They're flattening everything. They're not describing things. They're not using volume. They're using colors which are highly abstract. So this is to do with the organization of the picture surface. It's not to do with describing what people are actually wearing. And you see the stenciling on the right. So the stenciling on the right is, so you're getting, this comes from Cubism, where you get words inscribed on the surface of a picture, reminding you that this is a surface of a picture and not a space into which you're looking.
Yeah, there's always the suggestion of motion in all of these modernist paintings. I'm no expert in this, but you can kind of see that there's a focus on, maybe you could say, speed or like dynamism that seems to run through all of it, and that this is something that is, I think, deeply compatible with the right, even though it's a certain sort of certain flavor of the right, shall we say. There's a creation and a destruction that's sort of like simultaneously going on in the visual field, but also at a more sort of like sociological level, where the whole idea is that in order to say create the new, you have to destroy the old. So we spoke with Ed Dutton on a stream, I believe it was Conservatism and Nature, a while back, where I gave the example of the forest fire as the sort of like purifying fire that comes and cleanses the forest and hits the reset button and brings things back to sort of where they need to be, but that this is also a natural process and something that's in fact good, and sort of gets rid of all the dead wood that's kind of like choking out the biodiversity of the forest. And you can see the sort of like simultaneous aspect of creation and destruction, that this is what modernism is intended to do, and that this is a positive thing, and it's necessary to establish the new tradition. But also you can see that as well, I think, in the visual field. When you're looking at some of these paintings, there's just always motion. I can just always see the motion, even though you can't see the concrete people or necessarily any specific figures.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the next one you've got here is Bala. Is that right?
Yep. Giacomo, I think. Yeah. So this is quite a sweet one. I always used to hate this as an art student because it just seemed too cute. It was too cute to be real art.
I have a daily struggle to stop my wife buying a little dachshund. And now she's gone on to, I want a cat. I was like, absolutely not. And I'm saying, if you get that, I will not have nothing to do with it. I don't want to buy a single tin of food. I don't want to ever have, I think I've done enough to put her off, to be honest. I'm not a pet guy. But I do think those little dachshunds are cute. But I mean, you can see speaking to Mike's point, you can see the movement here. You can see the,
Yeah, because at this time, there'd been a lot of work on photography. So Edward Muybridge, who was an interesting character, sort of Anglo-American photographer, took a whole sequence of photographs of animals and people in motion. And it was like a sort of series of film strips. So this was just before there was any moving film. So you had a sequence of photographs of a particular figure or a particular animal going through a series of motions. And this was for the first time you could use high-speed photography to capture at parts of motion that had never been known before. So what you tend to get is, in old paintings of horses racing, you see the front legs going out to the front and the back legs going out to the back, when in fact that never actually happens in a moving horse. Mm-hmm. But they didn't know that until they photographed it, and they got the precise physiognomy of how animals moved and how people moved. And so you had and this went on to inspire artists directly, especially the futurists.
All right.
and later Francis Bacon, interestingly.
Yes, well, you have some Bacon coming up.
Yes, we do.
Okay, so we have another one. I mean, these all futurists? Just for
Yeah.
reference,
So all of these we've got 4 images by 3 futurists. So we're coming up to the last one now. So this is Umberto Boccioni, and I always forget the title of this. So this is Unique Forms of Continuity in Space, 1913. This is a bronze cast. I'm not sure if it's cast in bronze at the time, but this is done subsequently. This is an example of futurist sculpture. So you've got like a great sense of movement and flow and energy and great sense of power. It's actually also quite militaristic, because you look at that and you start thinking of not only movement but also suits of armor as well.
Now, if this was put up in Milton Keynes or something, do you think we'd get a PJW rant about? Do you think he'd be unhappy about this?
Well, yeah, the thing, no, but it's far too militaristic. No, you wouldn't get anything. You wouldn't get anything as punchy or powerful as this. You'd get like a sad refugee holding the hand of a child.
I mean,
or that famous new one of the arms clutching, which it looks like something obscene. Yes.
I mean, sorry for being so trite, but is his face a draw? Is his face
but
like
it's like a visor. It's like a visor on a knight's helmet.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
It looked like a cabinet drawer to me or something.
But yes, I mean, well, yeah, very similar. I mean, it involves, because that includes sort of forms from furniture, from Art Deco would come a bit later on, but that would be linked to this. You've also got like mechanical forms. So like sort of, you could imagine parts of these coming from a car, for example.
It's like a David Cronenberg nightmare. This guy is like merging with all his furniture and his machines.
Yes, this was the original Terminator.
He's become yes. Okay.
And ultimately, of course, many of the futurists met a sad end, because the war that they wanted duly arrived and dispatched them. So quite a few of them were actually killed in the First World War, fighting for Italy. The remaining futurists, a lot of them turned to conservative, religious subjects, sort of faux primitivism. You also get quite a lot of them joining up with the Italian mid-century people. Right.
Yeah. I mean, would the young big chin man have been into this stuff? Do we know? Or?
Yes, and certainly his press people were very into it. You'll find lots of posters using modernism, which comes directly from futurism, which goes directly into the posters. Very modernistic, front, sort of forward-facing, also influenced by the propaganda of the USSR in the immediate post-revolutionary period. So there was a very great overlap between radical typographical designs, which I'm sure that Farah has talked about on your streams many times, and Mr. D, of course.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a topic for a different stream, obviously, but
yeah.
I've always been quite interested in what I might describe as vitalist strains in Soviet art. It's kind of a strange, because I mean, we tend to think of like communism as terribly evil, and rightly so, etc. But there was a kind of strange. No, they did a lot of things that would be considered. That would be considered. They did a lot of pro masculine pursuits in the Soviet Union.
But there was a strand of socialist realism called heroic realism from the 1940s, and it was literally that. It was the Giga Chad wearing Soviet Red Army costume.
I mean, I'm aware of some very radical right figures / crypto communists in right-wing spaces who try to reclaim Stalin somehow as a kind of nationalist. Mike, I've never talked to you about that. What do you think of the idea of kind of like crypto nationalist Stalin, like late post-purge Stalin as a as actually like someone who flipped in some strange way.
Well, there is a book written by A. James Gregor, who is the foremost, or was the foremost authority on this Italian movement that we've been talking about, and he wrote the book Faces of Janus, which basically argued that that these were like these Italians and the Soviets were very much sort of two sides of the same coin. That there was actually very little difference between them, or that the differences between them were smaller anyway than what they shared. And yeah, certainly there was a vitality to the Soviet regime aesthetically, even in the music. Like you could think of something like Prokofiev or Shostakovich, and then
or the anthem, which is amazing.
Yeah,
the Soviet anthem, right?
Yeah, I can't remember what it's titled right now. I think it's the Red Army Choir. If you just look up Red Army Choir in on YouTube, it'll go some way towards redeeming this ideology for you. Maybe unfortunately, but yeah, there's certainly going in from the Stalinist period forward. There's almost a kind of recovery here where what Leninism did was he was that forest fire that came in and completely burned out what dead wood there was in the late imperial period. And after a period of chaos and the struggles that sort of like put Stalin where he was, there was a kind of quasi stability, I guess, that was established that allowed them to, kind of start to rebuild, I suppose, to rebuild a Russian identity. And there certainly was a seriously nationalistic fervor that runs through that. I don't think anyone can really deny that. Ideology notwithstanding, there was something there.
I've got this book by Stalin that was given to me at the first event by the subversive cringe walker. As a joke, he thought it'd be funny to give me a book written by Stalin. But obviously I read it, and it's actually really interesting because it's a book where, like all of these various communist thinkers are thinking about how language can be language needs to be rewritten, almost like a George Orwell idea that language has to be, it needs to reflect like communist ideology. And Stalin's like, no, we need to write in Russian because we're Russian. Our language is the same language as Tolstoy, is the same language, and then he just insists that all of this is rubbish and it needs to be there needs to be continuity with the Russian past, even as we go into the communist future. Which is kind of really interesting because it's kind of oddly reactionary, kind of pretty much nationalist essay by Stalin.
There was a great wave of Russian historicism in the immediate post-war period. It was called the Great Patriotic War. It wasn't called, the Great Socialist War. They thought of it in terms of Mother Russia saving civilization, saving the Soviet Union, with Russia taking on most of the burden. And there was a strong emphasis on the superiority of Russian culture in the immediate post-war period.
Just before we move off Stalin, I will say one of the, small pleasures I have when I read Stalin is the subtext. That when Stalin starts to critique, he's like, comrade, I'd be interested in your essay. There's always that subtext that he might just have them taken around the back and killed. So it's just like, you don't want to be critiqued by Stalin in like 1942 or something, because he probably would kill you afterwards. Anyway, let us move on. So this is Jacob Epstein now.
Yes. So this is a sort of member of sort of proto-member, associate of the Vorticist movement. The Vorticist movement founded by Wyndham Lewis in 1913, 1914. This is a 1913 photograph of a piece of sculpture called the Rock Drill. So what you have here is an actual rock drill and on top of that you have a plaster sculpture of a man, of a workman, and this is done in a sort of more radical modernist style. I don't know if you can click on it to enlarge it. No.
No, it doesn't let me.
Okay. Yeah, so basically what you've got is you've got similar forms to Boccioni, but Boccioni's sculpture was also 1913, so you've got two works of the same period.
Now, I hate to be so trite yet again, but I cannot help but think of, do you remember Roger? Do you remember Phantom Menace? The bloody...
Yes, yeah.
It does look like those little droids from the Clone Wars.
General Grievance or whatever he's called.
Yeah.
Grievous. Yes.
I wonder if Lucas got his inspiration from this.
Well, he might have done. What happened was Epstein kind of, I mean, this is an amazing piece of work because it's quite large. It's actually life size. That's the size of a figure would be, because that was how they used to work using this rock drill. The driver would actually stand on it, the operator would stand on it and operate it from above. So the figure is actually life size. He kind of he chickened out for some reason, and maybe it's just storage or something, but he cut it down so only the top of the figure remains. The actual drill, which is a real drill, was removed, and the bottom of the figure was removed. But so you can see the cut down version, which is in the Tate, I believe. So this is again praise of the mechanistic, of the destructive, of the power of the machine.
It's quite interesting when you get a look at it from a different perspective. I'm looking at some alternate pictures of it, and there's this one where it kind of looks like there's actually a man standing on top of it, like clearly that the figure on top of it. It looks like there's. It's a very strange, like you can almost see a face there where the torso is, if you know what I mean. So it's a little unsettling, really.
Yeah, I can see that. It looks like a little baby or something standing in there, like a little alien man or something.
Yes, I wouldn't be surprised if this influenced Geiger in his designs for Alien.
Yeah, let me just show you what I'm talking. You're talking about that, right, Mike? That little man in there. Yes.
Yeah, this is reconstruction. That's the original doesn't survive. Yeah.
Okay, so next one then is Dry Dock at Liverpool.
Well, it's not quite the next one. This is the last one, but I can't talk about this one. So this is Edward Wadsworth. So what happened was the Vorticist movement was founded in sort of 1913, 1914. And as soon as it was founded, of course, the Great War came. And so a lot of the artists were dispersed. T.E. Hume, who was a writer, not an artist, but he went into the service, and so did some of the other artists, including Wyndham Lewis. Wyndham Lewis was served with a Canadian artillery division, I think, and then he became a war artist. And he was very close, geographically close to where Hume was killed. Hume was killed in action. And some of the ideas, the radical ideas of the Cubists and the Futurists and then the Vorticists were actually employed, because this is a fairly accurate painting of of how British ships were decorated, or in fact camouflaged in a weird way, with what they called a dazzle pattern. So this is a dazzle ship. So instead of doing what you would expect to do to disguise a large ship in the sea, sort of painting it grey, maybe putting some organic shapes, what you would actually do is you would actually excuse me, you'd actually use striking geometric shapes and sudden dazzles and splashes of light.
I'm getting flashbacks to my little docker period where I watched The Wire season 2, and I wanted to work on the docks for a period. I felt that I needed a more authentic existence. I wanted to work. That lasted about a week, and then I remember that I liked
friend of the working man.
And then I remember that I was a friend of the working man who liked,
but not a working man.
Photos of my coffee and things like that. We also have a piece by Wyndham Lewis, which I skipped over. For some reason, it wasn't like hyperlinked in the doc.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But,
so this is one of the scenes that he painted during the war.
This we were talking about the Soviet realism. This, to me, if you showed me this and you didn't tell me who it was by and so on, I could have been forgiven for thinking that it was part of that in some way. Because
absolutely, it's the avant-garde of Russia at the time was pretty much indistinguishable from France, Germany, and Britain. It's only later that they started to split apart.
I wasn't even aware that there was this strain that looks just like Soviet realism, really. But you can see the I guess the dynamism in it, the heroism in it, as well as the kind of dehumanizing, mechanizing forces as well. At least that's what I get from it.
It's exhilarating, it's exciting, it celebrates it, as well as also showing you how tough conditions were, how unpleasant things were, and how reduced to sort of insects or machines men were in those conditions.
Right. I quite like this, but it's probably my favorite piece so far, this one. But
yeah, it's a great painting. Wyndham Lewis didn't paint as much as he should have because he was busy writing books. He used to get big advances for writing, well, medium-sized advances for writing books, and then he had to struggle to write the books. And then he was just going from advance to advance, and his publishers chasing him up about these books that he hadn't finished yet. But anyway, I don't want to bring flashbacks to you.
So now you have a picture of.
Yes, this is Edvard Munch. So this is sort of the Giga Chad of the symbolist movement, or the expressionist movement, depends on how you want to cut it. So born in 1863, I think it was. Yeah, 1863. So this is him sort of around 1900 in Norway, born into a very poor family. And Munch is not usually, everyone will know him for The Scream, which is coming up, but he's not usually considered a figure of the right because he wasn't particularly party political. He didn't talk much about politics. He was quite detached from that. But I think, as you'll see, in terms of his subjects and his themes and the way he treats them, he's very much, I would say, a perennialist, someone who deals in archetypes.
For some reason, from this photo, I feel like he could crop up in it's like a kind of 70s Roger Moore Bond movie or something. I don't know. That's the vibe. That's the vibe he's giving me. But probably because Roger Moore was always skiing somewhere in Europe. But yes. Okay, so this is this a self-portrait?
Yeah, so this is self-portrait with cigarette. Yeah, so he was he led a very turbulent life, a very heavy drinking, lots of affairs. One of them violent. His girlfriend shot off one of his fingers in a dispute. I don't know where the gun came.
We've all been there, don't worry.
Well, yes, absolutely. So he was a big smoker, big drinker. He was also a big gambler, and I think that's quite interesting. I think what you'll find is with people who are risk takers, they are naturally drawn to the right because, of course, the left is more to do with socialization of risk and socialization of cost. So I think that risk takers are naturally drawn to the right. They are more independent. They're loners. They feel like they can make it on their own.
Although I will say, I hate to keep on bringing this up all the time, but I've been thinking about it a fair bit. I feel like the what is typically called the conservatives are also risk averse and kind of life denying in a strange way.
Absolutely. Yes.
And so what most people think of as the right is that, not what you're describing. They think of almost a kind of like I think Bowden would call them ninnies, right? They think of a ninny, essentially, a kind of a scold, somebody who's always trying to get you not to do those things, but rather to do the right thing, which is, I don't know, like,
a moral nag, or the nudge unit, I suppose.
Right, I mean, ultimately, the height of what you should be doing is the hang, kill, grill, and helping old ladies across the road, something like this.
I'm trying not to bring in the Odinic-Tyrrhic distinction, but it's definitely it really sort of runs through that. There is this bifurcation in the right between a sort of forward-looking and more backward-looking strains, and if you can't put those two together, and if you just see the right wing as sort of like orientated towards for or against the status quo, especially, or even for or against tradition, then something like the radical right is always going to confuse and befuddle you. And a lot of what goes on in our scene is not going to really make a lot of sense. And perhaps even the term right wing or left wing doesn't make a lot of sense at the end of the day, but it's what the mainstream uses, so that's how we sort of have to classify ourselves.
I mean, I haven't really fleshed this out yet, but coming off the back of writing this book, thinking about the things I've been thinking about, and your Odinic Tyrrhic framing, Mike, which I always think is helpful. I've been thinking more in terms of like civilization affirming ways of being, and civilization, I don't know, there's this kind of other spirit of, I guess, what you might call creative destruction, right?
We could call them civilization founding. I wouldn't say civilization denying, but
they're not denying. It's like there's civilization maintenance, which I think is the Hank Hill work, and then there's civilization, like there's a kind of bursting forth of energy, right, that cannot really come from the civilization maintenance part. And I feel like a lot of the right are caught up in trying to maintain basically a civilization that hates them, essentially. And it's really this idea that if you just do those civilization maintaining things, somehow magically the bad stuff's going to go away, and then question mark, we win at the end. It's another version of the Steve Turley, like, just breed them out. I've talked about why I don't think that's going to work in the past, but
well, eventually the whole thing gets to be incoherent because you get these competing strains, and like eventually the canon gets to be too big, as I've said a few times in social media. And the decision kind of has to be made where, what is it that you're going to, what is the real tradition? What is it that you're going to affirm? At some stage that just becomes too unwieldy and too large. And that is when, you get something like the lawgiver in the ancient times, or the founding figure, or the Romulus, or what have you, that sort of comes to set things on a new foundation. But it's never a totally new foundation. There's always something that is carried forth from before. But these two competing strains in the right are a little bit confounding. You can even see that in the radical right, but between these two competing poles that are sort of jousting at the moment for supremacy. And realistically, I think it's the radical wing that is actually winning out. So yeah.
I mean, I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent, but I was doing I've been trying to catch up with various friends. I can't remember what episode it was, but BAP was discussing this. But I'm not sure about the way he framed it, because he was talking about the kind of two different ways of looking at civilization formation, like one being a kind of gradualist evolution thing, the other one being like a founding moment, like Moses arrives with the set of laws, essentially, right? And I feel like that second one isn't quite right either, because I don't really see like, who are these figures who turn up with a set of laws? What I see in history is a set of fucking savages who come along, who burn shit down and at some point what they conquer becomes so big that there's a need for administration and law and order, and so there has to be this flip from what you describe as the Odinic to the Tyrrhic, and that's where you get a lot of your, almost just from necessity, you need to maintain order somehow, and the order can't just be, oh, watch out, Genghis Khan might rape you type thing. It has to be something more than that. And so there's a process that goes on there. I'm not sure about the idea of the guy who comes with a ready-made set of laws. That seems to me to be
a lot of times
just made up.
A lot of times what you get is a kind of retconning of history where, and yeah, we won't go too far down this tangent, but where you've got the revolution, or you've got the sort of big bang of culture, whether it is through barbarism or revolution or what have you. And then you get someone like a Rousseau that comes along, a generation or two later and says, we was liberals back, in the primitive age as well. And it kind of tries to retroject what what recently happened all the way back to the beginning of time. So, and often that's where the lawgiver is, in some sense, a kind of invention. Whereas if you could go back and see the documentary footage, it might tell a much more violent and destructive story. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, well, I mean, again, not to go on too much of a tangent, but I feel like one of the guys I discuss, Toynbee, I feel like he ends up doing that. He ends up basically trying to like retcon his entire study of history as being like, oh, everything leads to a universalist religion, and this is actually like the kind of end goal of what a civilization needs to be, or something like that, which you can tell is just complete bollocks just from reading his own book. But I don't know, he just seems to so yeah, I mean, that's one of those things that as time goes on, I want to flesh out a bit more, because I do think a lot of the ideas people have about things are post hoc. They come after the fact, in much the manner you just described with Rousseau. Anyway, let us get back to Monk. This is his most famous work, I would say, by some distance.
So this is The Scream, of course, 1893. Few versions of this. So this was him expressing nature screaming through him, or this is, for example, what you could call the pathetic fallacy of beloved of literature scholars, where basically that nature or inanimate things reflect the emotions of the speaker or the looker.
Sorry, I'm just getting flashbacks to my A-level English class. That was my A-level English. Oh, look, there's pathetic fallacy. There's oh, look, it's raining. That's pathetic fallacy. Tick.
Yep. Well, this is the ultimate pathetic fallacy. You have the entire nature and the heart. Everything is screaming and squirming and swarming, expressing the angst of the screamer, who I think Monk identified as himself, but is quite generic, of course, because it's not actually him.
I have to laugh just thinking of that English teacher, who obviously I won't name in case she's listening or whatever, but whenever we were watching something, let's say there was a character who put like a pen to their mouth, she'd be like, oh, subtext. Sorry, she'd always be like, pen to the mouth means secretly giving a blowjob or wanting to do something.
That's the Freudian oral symbolism or something.
Yeah,
yes.
Always went for that, but yeah.
Anyway, so this was part of what Monk called the frieze of life. So he was interested in archetypes and recurring experiences. So obviously this sort of taps into sort of the idea of perennialism. So archetypes being discussed by Jung at this time and a little bit later, of course. And what you find is that Monk wants to paint this series, the frieze of life, which is exhibited for the first time in the 1890s in Berlin, where he was living. And it was essentially him talking about the essential stages that everyone goes through. And these are sort of atavistic, basic experiences that are inevitable and cannot be avoided by technology or civilization or culture or different cultures. It is something which is inherent in us. It is part of human nature. So, for example, you have birth, you have puberty, you have the flowering of woman, you have jealousy, you have betrayal, you have despair, you have sickness, you have death.
Again, flashbacks to my Shakespeare's "As You Like It," all the world a stage speech, which essentially says that as well. Although his framing is a little bit different, but it is basically the same idea.
And he was very much, and he believed he was damned by heredity. So he felt like he was not essentially, man was not essentially a product of culture. He was genetically, biologically, culturally, racially determined. So he felt that he had a long shadow cast over him because his mother and at least one of his sisters died of tuberculosis. In that sense, of course, that's not a psychological thing, that's a physiological thing. He actually risked tuberculosis. His father was supposedly a religious fanatic, religious crank, and he felt that he was crankish too. One of his sisters was confined to a madhouse at the end of her life, and he felt that he was toying with madness. So he felt that he was locked in his family and his racial and his sort of national history. So here you can see Munch as expressive of biological determinism, not absolutely outright, but this was something that was absolutely core to the way he saw himself and the way he saw the world.
Very
I think
interesting.
here's something right wing that you can take out of him, even if he doesn't have it explicitly in his politics, is that he kind of accepts man's thrownness into the world, and that the sort of immanence of the man as embodied in the world, that this is basically what man fundamentally is. I know that this would sort of disagree a little bit with a more Evolian perspective, but I think that that you see a lot of this sort of running through Romanticism and into obviously someone like Heidegger and whatnot. That this is this is a bona fide strain of right wing thought. This sort of like hyper immanence. That if that's how he sort of saw the world, and this is sort of some of the genesis of his paintings, that could be seen as a right wing strain of thought running through him.
I mean, you call it the tragic view of life, right? This is really what you're getting at. It's this idea that there are aspects of being human and human nature that are inescapable, that cannot be overcome by unconstrained rationalism, effectively, right? This is I mean, I know people don't like to read Thomas Sowell too much these days, but that book, A Conflict of Visions, really does get at, I think, a really fundamental split that still exists between all forms of rightists and all forms of leftists even today, where the left wing in some respects just cannot face reality head on, whereas the right accept that aspects of life are shit. That it accepts that there is tragedy in life. It accepts that some things aren't fair, So, okay. So the next one then is Death in the Sick Room.
So here is an example of what I was talking about. So this is based on, I think it's the death of his sister. So his mother died and his sister both died of tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is very common in Norway. Norway, of course, now we think of it as a very rich country. At the time, it's extremely poor. The land was quite poor. Lots of Norwegian immigration to North America because of the great poverty and the hardship of living on the land, something which is captured in the work of Knut Hamsun. Knut Hamsun, the Norwegian novelist, noted reactionary and supporter of the mid-century Germans when they occupied Norway. Also, of course, a big gambler, interestingly. So although apparently I didn't find, when I was looking into this, I didn't find that much direct connection between Munch and Hamsun. But whenever you buy a Knut Hamsun book, because I've been buying a few recently, you'll find an Edvard Munch painting on the cover.
I mean, this is this really does bring across the austerity of that room. You can kind of feel the vibe of it. I'm reminded of many cold Ingmar Bergman films that I watched back in the day, but
and
similar
Ibsen
vibe from
plays.
Norway. And Ibsen plays and kind of this boy at the back, you know, if you only knew how bad things are, this kid.
Yes. So this is obviously part of the Frieze of life. This is an inevitable stage, and that's a stage that he went through personally a number of times in his own family.
Yeah. Okay, so now vampire.
Yeah, so he lived in he had quite a turbulent private life. He had lots of affairs. He was living in Berlin and was surrounded by people who are having unhappy love affairs and jumping in and out of beds, and then sort of committing suicide, basically. He had a lot of anarchist thoughts. This was also when he was in contact with Strindberg. They were a little bit wary of each other. And so there were lots of ideas to do with the. So there was Otto Weiniger. Was it Sex and Character? Was sort of 1900 or so, just a few years after this. So there was a lot of talk about the woman's spirit, the poison of woman, the insidious nature of woman, and so Munch, who kind of suffered a little bit in his private life, tended to see women as beautiful goddesses, as Madonnas, but then also as potential vampires. So here we have vampire, and the long red hair apparently is based on the long red hair of an Irish musician who lived in Berlin at the time and with whom he had an affair or wanted to have an affair. And he is, of course, the victim.
Yes, many such cases. People say, yeah, okay.
Yeah. But by the way, interestingly enough, the futurists said, unconnected with this, of course, they were a bit later. They said, "We will destroy museums, libraries, and fight against moralism, feminism, and all utilitarian cowardice." So a little bit of vanguardism overlapping.
Interesting. Okay. I'll tell you one thing I have discovered since I've been doing my my little tournaments on Twitter and so on. Many of the ones who do really well are half Irish, and I don't know what. You said she was Irish. I don't know what that is, but many of the kind of top tier beauties are secretly half Irish. If you look into their kind of early life history and so on. So, although they tend to have dark hair rather than red hair, but it's just something I have noted. Okay, this next one now is a picture of.
So this is Friedrich Nietzsche, of course, 1906. Munch was, of course, a huge fan of Nietzsche. Nietzsche was a great influence on the symbolists and the expressionists and all sorts of intellectuals of sort of, well, essentially the 1890s onwards. Sadly, of course, Nietzsche himself, I think had his breakdown in 1890, I believe, in Turin, and never saw the sort of the acclaim that he would get later on.
I always think, and I hate to have such a modern thought, I always think that if Nietzsche was around now, he would be one of the all-time champions of Twitter. You know, like we say, like Trump is a god tier user of Twitter. I honestly think if you read Nietzsche, it's hard not to think of him as like proto, like tweet banger. You know, he writes, especially the aphorisms and things. So was Munch kind of into Nietzschean philosophy, or did he just was he interested in him
I think he did. I think he would. He definitely received a lot of ideas secondhand from Nietzsche. I don't know how much he read directly, but Nietzsche was, of course, someone that all his anarchist friends and his socialist friends and his sort of radical friends, radical intellectual poet friends, were talking about in the 1890s in Berlin. So he was very familiar with the ideas, and I think he became sort of symbolized heroic isolation or a heroic detachment, which I think is a fair assessment.
I mean, while we're on the subject of this, given what we've been talking about in the stream, I mean, there was some attempt by the Academy to try to has been an attempt to claim Nietzsche for the left. I mean, what do you guys think of that? The claiming of Nietzsche as that there's a kind of version of Nietzsche that is taught in universities and so on. With some of them.
Yeah, but yeah, okay. Well, he was on the leftist side, he was anti-Christian. I mean, he was virulently anti-Christian.
Mm-hmm.
He also believed in the development of man. So although he was interested in cyclical history, and he did to a degree believe in sort of eternal recurrence. He was also a believer in cyclical history because, of course, he was projecting forward towards the Übermensch, the Superman, the superior being who would advance humanity, which, of course, is a linear concept. So he was kind of struggling between linear and cyclical views of history. And he was also, it is fair to say, not an anti-Semite. That the aspects that seemed anti-Semitic were played up by his sister and by some of his supporters after his death. He himself was not actually anti-Semitic himself, but he was quite hostile to organized religion, especially Judeo-Christianism. So, yeah.
Yeah, the iconoclasm of Nietzsche is really sort of seized upon by the left as the sum and substance of what he's about, and I think that this is the only interpretation where it makes sense to claim him for themselves. But I don't think that that's anything inherently left-wing, as we've been sort of discussing throughout the stream, that like there is a sense in which the right is a destroyer as well as a creator, and that this really sort of embodies what he was trying to do. He's in some ways a kind of Janus-like figure where he looks backwards to ancient Greece, and not even just classical Greece. I think he's written somewhere, if I'm recalling correctly, that even Homer is a kind of degeneration from what he saw as an even more primitive. Or maybe it was the Odyssey. I can't remember the quote exactly, where he was saying, well, the Odyssey is a little bit too cucked, and when it's all about the Iliad. So he's a reactionary, but at the same time, he's also one of the most progressive figures in the history of philosophy. He's looking to the distant future. He's trying to sort of carve a path for the great man to walk in the future. So yeah, I think the idea that he is inherently left-wing is quite mistaken, but he's a complicated figure, one of the true geniuses, one of the greatest philosophers of all time, and like anyone, like a Plato could be claimed in some ways for either the left or the right. I think Nietzsche sort of is a little bit uncategorizable, and that this is part of what sort of characterizes the great man that he's sort of striving towards.
Yeah, of course, we mentioned Bronze Age pervert. He's probably the foremost kind of Nietzsche exponent currently around. But also, you mentioned Bowden earlier on, Alexander, and he as well was a self-avowed Nietzschean, right? So there is a kind of a right-wing Nietzscheanism that exists, vitalism or whatever they call it. I have to say, when I was writing Prophets of Doom, my original plan was to have chapters on Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, but I decided against either of those chapters in the end. I had to justify it to the publisher and so on, but when push came to shove, I did not think that, even though Nietzsche is everywhere in the book as an influence on Spengler and influence on Evola and influence on all these other people, I did not think that his own actual view of history is necessarily part of that tradition, even though it has a great influence on that tradition. Just a bit too complicated, I guess, to fit into that general pattern. So I kind of left them both out. I thought that was the neatest thing to do, but maybe I'll regret it in years to come. We'll see. But yes, shall we move on then? So this is Francis Bacon.
So Francis Bacon, Anglo-Irish painter, born in Dublin in 1909. Considered today probably the leading figure painter alongside Picasso of the 20th century. Seminal British artist, a standard bearer of figurative art in a time when abstraction was coming to the fore. He was quite an individualist. Again, he was homosexual. So at this time, this was illegal. So he was deeply involved in sort of minor petty criminality, the sort of the underworld. Later on, he became sort of quite chummy with various gangsters in the East End, the Cray twins, for example. And one of his most famous lovers, George Dyer, was an unsuccessful burglar who was affiliated. Who was he was unsuccessful, so he always needed money from Francis Bacon to go and get drunk because he wasn't making enough on the street, as it were, from sort of stealing or strong arming people. Francis Bacon, born in Ireland, went to sort of public schools in England, came from a sort of minor aristocracy, as it were. He got involved in the art scene in the 1930s when he started, where he was initially interested in doing some furniture. And that big mirror you can see behind him was actually a relic. This is a photograph from 1971, but that's a relic of something that he did in 1930. And that's practically the only thing that by him, any furniture of him that he actually kept, because he was only in that field for a couple of years. Moved into fine art, sort of spent a lot of time with rich patrons, with rich gentlemen who were older than him, who sort of basically paid his way, educated him, taught him the finer aspects of life. So he became a big drinker, big gambler, again, risk taker, having lots of casual sex, having sort of rough trade sex. So again, risk taking, a loner.
I mean, sorry to stop you, but there'll be people watching this who'll be thinking like,
yes, I know what they're thinking.
This is not sounding very promising. Like, is modern art left wing? I mean,
well,
kind of a renegade homosexual who engages in casual sex, etc.
Ask Mr. D. Ask Mr. D. I'll give a shout out now. If you and Mr. D want to do a deepest law, or 1 or 2 or 3 program series on Francis Bacon, there is plenty of material. He's a fascinating character, and I know that Mr. D is a fan as well. So, not that I'm inviting myself onto your channel or anything. So he becomes a painter. He worked. He saw a lot of death. He was in London during the Blitz. He worked as an air raid warden. So he's basically pulling out bodies or parts of bodies out of buildings in the 1940s. He only did that briefly because he had very bad asthma, something that would eventually lead to his death. He had bad asthma, so he was invalided out of the air raid division. Painting, hanging around, getting money from older gentlemen. And he painted, if you want to go on to the next image, I think, yeah. So this is him later in life. So this is him in front of a 1967 triptych, based on a poem by T.S. Eliot, Sweeney Agonistes. So it's a triptych after Eliot. Yeah. So anyway, let's go on to the next. So this is him as a sort of as a dandy. So he was he favoured long coats, especially sort of long Gestapo style coats, and very very tight waistbands. He used to wear very expensive watches because that's a signal to rough trade that you can pay for sex. So. So he'd be flashing this when he went into the East End pubs, so that all the rough boys knew that he was good for his
Right. Okay. And this is
so this is study for base of a crucifixion, 1944 to 1945. It's a triptych which is in the Tate, and as you can see, this is pretty bleak, horrible image. So this is sort of seen as his calling card. This is his first mature work. So here we have figures which are less than human or more than animal, somewhere in between. And they are highly artificial, and they seem to be tormented, and they were seen as sort of like avatars of war and suffering.
And I hate to pull the old Paul Joseph Watson, right, but I can just imagine him in front of his world map. Be like, Alexander, you've talked about homosexual guy who, wants to get sex from the trade, rough trade or whatever, and now he produces this. Imagine my shock, he'd say. How is this not left wing? Would be the question.
Well, absolutely. Well, this is an exploration of the deep animalistic, atavistic power of the subhuman, of the Untermensch, perhaps. So, in a way, you could say, well, this is quite a bleak view of suffering. This is in line with the Eumenides, the Furies from Aeschylus, which he knew about through T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot evoked them in his first play, which the name of which escapes me. But anyway, so Eliot was dwelling on these horrors, these horrible apparitions, and I would say that this is a good example of the horrors of humanity and the inherent tragic vision of human existence.
I mean, I'll just say this is how I imagine various members of the chat. What do you think of this one, Mike?
Yeah, it's interesting in that it's sort of like moving towards something like Beksinski. I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, but it definitely does have that underlying element of, like, when you look at something like this, you just sort of think of the rationality of the Enlightenment as something that's very much in the rearview mirror, right? Like, and I think this is something that it shares, that modernism shares with Romanticism, is a rejection of rationality and as a kind of basis for life. But whereas Romanticism rejects it on philosophical grounds, I mean, modernism rejects anything like, you look at these man-made horrors beyond human comprehension, and it sort of rejects rationality or like as a basis for life on empirical grounds, in a much less philosophical way. It doesn't try to show how rationality, perhaps can't be the basis of the social order, which is kind of what someone like Herder or von Savigny or Hamann would be saying. It just says, look around, look at the fruits of enlightenment. This is the, as Alexander said before, it's the subhuman sort of substrate of our world. It just says, it holds it up for you to look at, and it tries to find some sort of catharsis in it, which is difficult with this painting. But
it's like
yes.
logging into Twitter, the painting,
Yeah.
Here it is, confronted with this stuff 24/7. Especially this figure. I would say of these three figures who symbolizes our time the most. I feel like this braying kind of dog-like thing on the right. That's basically the age of perpetual outrage. You know,
It's completely blind as well.
Everybody just broadcasting their views out to the world. You know, social media was a disaster, I tell you. But yeah, and the blindness, of course. All right, so let's move on, because I think there's a certain movie that a lot of people are going to immediately bring up when we look at this one.
Okay. So this is Head 2 from 1949. At the time, Bacon was living in Monte Carlo, basically for the casino. I mean, he liked the food, he liked the weather, and Britain in the 1940s was pretty bleak and unpleasant. So he spent a lot of time in Monte Carlo. He was living off gambling. He could have these incredible runs, these great wins, and so he was able to pay for a nice apartment for a while. And so again, risk taking. So big drinker, generous with money, very open-handed, taking lots of risks. He would take risks in his paintings as well, including sort of like throwing paint at the surface. This isn't one of those, but yeah. So here we have this sort of animal apparition. So this is maybe a sort of an Eraserhead, a proto Eraserhead, maybe. So we have a sort of like a chimpanzee person thing with glasses roaring in front of a curtain.
Horrific.
Yes.
What do you make of that, Mike?
To be honest, I can't even see what's going on here. I don't know where it's kind of hard to make out where the figure, like where the face is even.
Well, I thought this was like a little alien creature breaking out of an egg or something. That's what I can see.
Oh, you thought it was alien? Okay. Well, yes, yeah.
Or like when you mentioned the Razorhead, like the little alien baby breaking out of an egg. That's what it looked like to me. But I could be.
So Bacon was stressing the animalistic qualities, which is not a very left-wing view. Now, obviously, there's like the right-wing view, which is to do with the person, the human being as a spiritual being. But then there is also the other right-wing view of the idea of the human being as an animal and having animal qualities and seeing something human in animals. Now, Bacon spent a lot of time looking at photographs of animals. He went on safari a couple of times. He was also an atheist, so he was not a spiritual person, but he was deeply involved with religion. He really liked the imagery of religion. He liked the impact, and he liked the order of religion, and he liked some of the customs and so forth. But he himself was not religious, which gives his view sort of an added bleakness.
Mm-hmm. I can relate to that, especially my reading Revelation with cool language and stuff like that. But all right, let's move on though, because I mean, what do we have here? This is a female, obviously female figure.
Oh, please.
With a male shadow.
I beg you to reconsider. No, this is two men.
What? Okay, go on.
Okay, well, yes. It's either two men or it's one man in motion. Let's say. Let's make it.
I thought it was a female figure with a male shadow.
That was what I saw too. Yeah.
No, I think it's two men. But I mean, I could be corrected. So this is a 1950 painting called Painting. It's housed in Leeds. This is actually one of the slightly more colourful paintings from the period when black was dominating his palette. But yeah, so he's very interested in physique. He was an open homosexual and a delighter in the male form. And here, I think this is quite a muscular form, I would say.
Certainly the legs are muscular and have that look to them.
I don't know. I was just thinking that like when women like wash their hair or whatever, they put their arms up and like I can see her with her kind of. I can see like an elbow up there. I feel like men don't do that, but I could be wrong.
Also, this is probably based on one of the photographs by Muybridge. You remember I talked about Muybridge doing the early sequence photographs of – figures in motion. This is probably based on one of those.
Okay, so let's carry on. I kind of like the I kind of like my the reading where it's a woman with a man's shadow, because it speaks to what's going on at the moment. But
Well, yes.
anyway,
The
let us
devouring
move
female,
on.
yes. So here we have Pope, 1951, series of Pope paintings that Bacon made based on photographs of popes and also some classic old master paintings. So he was very interested in the idea of separation, the separation of the figure of power, of isolation, of being raised up in an isolated setting. So here you have a figure which is in a sort of a classical setting, but it's also in a box, in a case. Sometimes these have been related to the trial of Adolf Eichmann, who was placed in a glass box quite famously when he was tried in Israel for his crimes during the 1940s. And Francis Bacon was deeply interested in the mid-century Germans as well. So a lot of imagery comes from that.
Interesting.
What's coming to mind here, apart from the last painting, perhaps, is that from what we've seen with Edvard Munch and Francis Bacon, there's a lot less motion going on here. There's a lot less dynamism. There's a lot more static poses in the last two artists, and I don't know why that would be, or I couldn't hazard a guess, but there is that difference. Maybe it's something to do. Well, a lot of the ones with Munch were from pre-World War One. Is that right?
Yes, yeah, they were from the 1890s and something.
Okay, I would have hazarded a guess that after World War One something changed, but no, I guess not.
What's this? What's this pipe? Seems to be like.
Yeah, it's essentially a railing with a curtain attached.
Oh, right, this is a curtain. I thought it was like oil spurting out or something. Okay,
yeah, well,
right.
I mean, it's painted in quite a rough way, so it's quite exciting to look at. You can see how it's been made. You can see the brush marks if you ever get up close to these paintings. But he had a habit of introducing these sort of armatures. So you'd have like steel framework, you'd have the edges of glass boxes, you'd have sort of plinths and so forth. So you'd have these sort of artificial facets, planar shapes, which would encase quite sort of organic, rounded, volumetric figures.
I hate to make yet another lowbrow Star Wars reference, but I've always loved the idea that the Pope can do Sith lightning. I just think, like, well, if you get to be Pope, you should be able to do lightning, I think. But this Pope here looks like he could do lightning to me. So I just thought I had to mention that. All right, so this is called Two Figures.
This is Two Figures. Yes, so this is from 1953, and this is technically a painting of two wrestlers, but it was interpreted as sex, basically, at the time. And when this was exhibited in a separate room at the back of the gallery that you had to ask to gain entry to, because it was considered too shocking to put in public space. Now, Francis Bacon, big risk taker, he was unapologetic about being homosexual. He didn't feel that he needed to explain or to apologize for that. He just lived how he lived. He had the airs of a natural aristocrat, which I think fit very well onto the idea, the model of a risk-taking, reactionary right winger. Even so, you obviously have the homosexual aspect as well, which is not traditional.
Now, without getting into the mechanics of gay sex, is that what we're seeing here? Because they're facing each other. Is that like?
Yeah, it's not literal penetration. No.
Right, I see. They're just
rest assured, you haven't been doing it wrong all these years.
Having a hug or whatever, you know. All right, so let us move on to the last one.
Yep. So this is the last one. So this is a portrait. 3 studies for a portrait of George Dyer. This is the unsuccessful burglar, the petty criminal, painted in 1963. A few years later, while Francis Bacon was preparing for his big exhibition in 1971, I believe it was, in Paris, George Dyer was in Paris with him for the opening, and he committed suicide, or at least he died by taking an overdose of pills that were given to him to try and curb his alcoholism. So Bacon saw the brutality of life firsthand. He had lovers die. He had the experience of masochistic sex. He had lost great fortunes at the casino. He destroyed paintings that were brilliant, that would have earned him a lot of money, but he felt that they weren't good enough, or he went a little bit too far and he spoiled the paintings, so he ended up losing them. So I think what you've got here is a natural risk taker, someone who's interested in power, someone who wants to talk about the essential tragic nature of human beings. He was also, politically speaking, voted conservative only because they interfered least with private freedom. Oh, how times have changed. Ironic laugh.
Mike, any thoughts on this?
I'm just sort of thinking he really liked triptychs, didn't he? He seemed to like to paint things in threes quite a lot, actually.
Yeah, and that comes from religious. That's religious art. It comes from religious art. So
yeah.
I don't know why I'm getting a vibe of like Mark E. Smith from the Fall or someone like that.
Yes, he was someone I wanted to mention in terms of music, reactionary music, but perhaps that's for another stream.
Well, I mean, we could just as we're before we hit the super chats here. Obviously Francis Bacon. We've come up to. I mean, that painting was 1963.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people would say yes, even if they accepted all of that we've just talked about. Italian futurism was a long time ago. Even 1963 was a long time ago. What about everything like since the 60s? Are there any spaces for the right in art since the 60s? And I think, Mike, you were going to talk about this a little bit, and then I'll let you come in, Alexander.
Sure, yeah. There have been quite a few, actually. So you think of... I'm trying to think of... Because there's basically two main currents that we could talk about, and they're related. One of them is punk rock, and the other one is industrial music, especially the early industrial scene. Maybe punk is a good one to start with. But
punk.
sorry.
I mean, did you not get the memo, Mike? Look, you can't be punk and also be racist, sexist, homophobic, or transforming. It's impossible. So,
well, it's a little strange because there's a bit of a performative contradiction with being, basically being the ultimate outsider movement and then defending the last sacred cow that society has left. I mean, punk was always a fertile ground for the radical right. There's a really good documentary called Punk Attitude that tries to define it. And it's not easy because so much gets lumped in with punk that doesn't sound very punk. You could think of something like new wave or post-punk or some of the more bizarre experimental guitar music and everything. So this documentary doesn't really land on a sound so much as an attitude, hence the title. And the attitude of punk is basically DIY. It's saying, screw you, I'm going to do it my way. In other words, don't take what polite society tells you for granted. Figure things out for yourself. So this is the ethos of punk, supposedly. And I think for anyone with any real intellectual honesty, this is eventually going to lead you to reject liberalism and all the things that that meme is telling you to embrace. And there's another reason why punk attracted a lot of radical right energy as well. There's another good punk documentary called American Hardcore, where one of the talking heads kind of accidentally explains this. He kind of says that, whereas Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath and Judas Priest or whatever, all the metal bands of that era were based in blues rock, whereas they were all built on American black music. Punk was the first rock genre to really purge all the African-American elements. It was the first genuinely popular rock genre to be a kind of native expression of Europeans. And he doesn't say it in these terms, but this is the basic idea. So naturally, I think pretty much as soon as punk gains any traction, the radical right shows up. And there were quite a few songs that spoke directly to people, like from the National Front and whatnot, who started to show up at gigs and very much alarmed the scene pretty soon after it started. You get songs like White Riot by The Clash, which is basically talking about white folks doing it for themselves. And songs like Guilty of Being White by Minor Threat, which is something that they can't play today, suffice it to say. And there was a massive Southern California radical right-wing punk scene to where the genre was seriously in danger of being crowded out by these people. So you get songs by the Dead Kennedys to that effect.
One of the very earliest episodes of the Deepest Law, I mean, this is episode 111 of Deepest Law now, but I can't remember exactly what number it is, but it's one of the early ones, like first 5 shows, is where Johnny Rotten, John Lydon, he just goes on a bus ride around London, and he's just moaning about how London is shithole, basically. And many of his talking points are ones that we would recognise. And of course, I mean, since he came out as a Brexit voter, and he kind of doesn't like woke stuff and so on. So I mean, I'm not saying like, oh, the Sex Pistols were right wing, but there's something in the energy of some of those bands that wasn't the kind of left wing that we see now either. I would suggest.
Well, Lydon is a kind of old school, like Labour voter, like someone who would have voted Labour in the 1970s and 80s. And of course, that now is just horribly reactionary, what they would have stood for. And at the end of the day, punk is about sticking a big fat middle finger up at everything that your society holds near and dear. And it was kind of not long before this finally reached its logical conclusion. So you'd get like Sid Vicious using mid-century German symbols and whatnot. Like, punk is about transgressing boundaries, and this is the ultimate boundary, and the internal logic of punk sort of demands that it go there. So you get this weird situation where, as I said, punk frames itself as this kind of like, ultimate outsider movement, but it's defending what's really kind of at the core of society's values. So that's a little bit strange. And interestingly, along sort of what's happening at the same time, parallel to punk in some ways, is the early industrial scene is developing in the UK. And this is much less well known. Obviously, industrial music did sort of gain purchase later on as, Nine Inch Nails and Rammstein and other bands like that became popular. But in its early phases, it very much more resembled something like The Art of Noises, Luigi Russolo, that we spoke about before, and even the experimental sort of music of the 1950s, or musique concrète, which was basically something like found sounds and tape manipulation and things. All these weird sort of very forward-looking futurist movements through the mid-20th century that sort of came back in like late 1970s London, in that scene, where it was doing weird experimental stuff, very harsh sort of abstract noise music, but it had the same punk energy and attitude, where but it was going way further with it, whereas punk was mostly abrasive in its subject matter and delivery. Something like Throbbing Gristle or White House or Current 93, like early industrial bands, were commodifying things like mass murder and terror as a kind of entertaining spectacle. Like, if you listen to the first Throbbing Gristle album, which is ironically titled The Second Annual Report of Throbbing Gristle, you'll get this, I believe it's an interview with a serial killer, sort of over this fuzzed out synthesizer music, where he's just explaining how he basically raped and tortured and killed some girl. So this is kind of the kind of thing that's on offer for the earlier industrial music scene, and it's all about breaking taboos. It's kind of like, I guess the idea is, ridding ourselves of social indoctrination and rediscovering our intuitive connection to our like animalistic spirit or whatever. And yeah, it gets really far out there to where it's not clear. The lines between irony and seriousness and earnestness are very much blurred, especially in an act like White House that would sample our Austrian painter and hurl racial abuse at the audience and things like that, where it's not really clear whether that's meant to provoke or meant seriously, kind of thing. So you do get these weird currents, and then Current 93 is another very interesting example where basically what this started out as is kind of like harsh and weird soundscapes along with apocalyptic poetry and like screamed delivery, and talking about like there's this one song off their second album, it's called Jesus Wept, where it's just this bizarre apocalyptic poetry and he's screaming the words Jesus wept. It's almost like a parody on that Bible verse. But interestingly, David Tibet, who is the creative force behind Current 93, eventually becomes a practicing Christian and sort of drifts into neo-folk territory. So they undergo a kind of creative evolution. But there's always that weird right-wing, militaristic, dark, ambient thing going on. There's nothing left-wing about Current 93 and some of these other industrial bands, although Throbbing Gristle sort of famously had a transvestite for a front person. I'm not sure. But there's definitely something that harkens back to the early, what we're talking about with modernism in terms of holding up the ugliness of the world for one to see and embrace it. And, that this is something that I don't think is very left wing, there's no moral lesson at the end of the day, like there would be in a left wing context.
Now, one of the things that's always struck me about punk in particular is that it's incredibly short lived. It kind of like almost as soon as punk gets going, post punk is up and running already. This is something I've never quite understood, that post punk goes on forever. I mean, people are still making post punk albums now. Although, there was clearly a high point in the late 70s and the 80s and so on. And of course, there's the split between post punk and new wave. Now, are any of those acts? Is there any scope for any right wingery in there, in your guys' view? Or because I've always thought that some of those bands, like I'm thinking like Wire, Per Ubu, they feel left wing to me. They feel Gang of Four. I mean, to me, all of those bands feel like they just be like straight up kind of like, progressives or whatever. But then there are other acts like maybe The Fall, Joy Division, probably like lots of the new wave, even though lots of them were gay.
maybe the Stranglers as well. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, maybe. Joy Division, like Ian Curtis certainly had right-wing sensibilities, and we could talk about Morrissey as well.
Yeah.
And another band that's maybe not as well known as those, although not totally obscure, is called Big Black. Steve Albini was the producer of many rock bands, many successful rock bands in the 90s. He's sort of more famous as a producer than an artist in his own right. But Big Black is amazing, one of my favorite bands. And they're basically, he's sort of doing, it's very punk in its own right, but it's post-punk. It's not quite the same. It's like almost a cross between industrial and punk rock. But what he's basically doing is he tends to write a song from a perspective of some like absolutely degenerated person or whatever. So somebody who is, he's got a song called Kerosene where he's talking about like, kids in some burnt out rural town that are just sniffing kerosene, and eventually just they're bored, so they decide to light themselves on fire, kind of thing. Again, it's very bleak. It's very much looking at the world for what it is and trying not to shy away from the horror of modernity. But there's no lesson behind it. It's just what it is. It's just trying to hold it up as just what it is.
I think what we've been circling around for this whole conversation is that there's there's a tendency in our sort of circles to think that unless something is quote unquote wholesome, right, or unless something has a didactic moral on the end of it, right, then in some way it's like tainting, or in some way it's kind of drawing you away from the light into something else, and this in itself is a left-wing thing. I feel like, I mean, I've just been like glancing at the comments once or twice during the whole 2 hours here, and I mean, how do you guys deal with those sorts of objections? Because I think they're extremely common in our sort of spaces. And I'll go to Mike first, and then I'll let you have the final word, Alexander.
So the objection being that what was the objection again against the right wing?
So I think there's this kind of assumption lurking behind a lot of the pushback that I've seen in the comments and so on. It's basically like, unless the subject matter is wholesome or uplifting in some way, or affirming like family values or something like this, then contact with these forms or these arts that you guys have been discussing in some way is kind of like degenerate. It's kind of tainting. It's bringing in darkness instead of leading you towards the quote unquote light, and therefore there's a kind of instinctual reaction against it as being bad, and therefore left wing, etc.
I think that this view of what art is in terms of whether it's right or left wing is, I mean, it's necessarily tied to a time and place, but it's nothing eternal. Like, we published a book in our Studies in Reaction series where the main character in this book feels slighted by his comrades, and so he decides that in order to preserve his honor, he's going to kill every single one of them, which he fails at doing because he goes insane and then slaughters a whole bunch of livestock instead. Then he realizes what he's done, and he's even more shamed, so he commits suicide. That to me doesn't really seem to give you much of anything. It doesn't really give you a moral at the end of the day to sort of like hang your worldview on. But it's of course one of the greatest tragedies ever written by Sophocles. So I think if we're going to say that it has to have an uplifting or an edifying moral, that's the criterion of being right wing and everything else is left wing, then we're going to have to basically throw out all Greek tragedy. So I don't really buy that. I don't think that's a very viable objection just for that reason.
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes feel like they just want the world to be like a kind of sepia toned Hallmark movie that like a kind of middle-aged woman would watch in the on a Sunday afternoon or something.
I mean, in the end, you can do everything right. You can have you can be a moral person. You can make all the right decisions. You can do what you're supposed to, and it may turn out that terrible things happen to you, and that's how life is, and that it's kind of a more of a mature view, I think, to just face up to that. Like if you look at something like the Epic of Gilgamesh, where he goes through all this epic struggle to basically secure immortality for himself, fails at it, and then comes back to the city of Uruk, looks on the walls and says, well, I can live through my deeds, and that's good enough. That, sometimes things don't all turn out for the best, and sometimes we have to live with tragedy, and sometimes the world is a harsh place, and that it's a much more mature view of the world to be able to accept that, and that maybe in the end, good doesn't always win.
Well, I mean, this is what makes trying to bring Shakespeare into things. But like, if you think of a play with like the kind of nihilistic despair of Macbeth and confronts it head on and doesn't look away, I mean, this is the sort of thing that makes great art, not the kind of almost kind of like birthday postcard version of the world that these people seem to want. Like, I just don't understand the constant insistence of, well, if it isn't capital B beauty, then it's like, well, I mean, what's beautiful about a play like Macbeth? He's a fucking psycho. He kills loads of people. There's a scene where a 12-year-old kid is brutally murdered on stage. I mean, this is not like life edifying stuff. It is dark.
I think that if you have to demand, I think that if you have to demand of art that it give you a transcendent and uplifting, life-affirming message, that anything that doesn't do that is left-wing, then we lose too much, that it puts too much into the left-wing camp that doesn't legitimately belong there. So I guess that would be my response to that objection.
Mr. Adams.
Well, I would say that as on the right, I mean, we've got this problem between the division between the conservatives and the reactionaries. So what do you say when you talk about modern art or contemporary art, and we see work that we wouldn't consider traditional, we couldn't consider it attractive? Well, because there are two ways of looking at this. So the conservative prioritizes beauty over ugliness, and so obviously the conservative is fighting against the ugliness of the modern city, of modern buildings, of a lot of contemporary art. So they've got a lot to work against, and there are a lot of people who have ugly spirits, who want to make people want to degrade as they themselves are degraded, even though they may have degraded themselves. So the conservative is searching for beauty there. The reactionary is searching for truth, and that truth may be ugly. So obviously the reactionary is pushing against the progressive, who is telling the lies about how humanity can be reformed, how problems come from social restrictions rather than from the moral character or the motivations, the internal motivations of people. So the reactionary is in search of truth, whereas the progressive is set on this constructivist lie. So then you've still got a bit of a mess, because it's the reactionary wanting truth, even though it might be ugly, and then there's the conservative wanting beauty, even though it might actually elide some things that are better revealed.
I mean, let me just make a concrete analogy to try to hammer home what I think we've all been trying to get at in various ways, right? Just a normal everyday type of thing, okay? A left-wing HR poster with the horrible, the Globo Homo art, right? And it's got like a lovely black man pushing like a tranny in a wheelchair, everybody in the happy, diverse Globo Homo world kind of planting trees together, or some utopian vision, versus on any given day on Twitter, I'll just leave a tweet with "civilization is incommunicable" with some just a bit of footage of feral children beating each other up in a school or whatever. Or I mean, just today there's an incident in Ireland of some of the new Irish causing trouble, and I feel like the conservative reaction to that situation, where we're just trying to hold up a light, this is life as it really is, versus the lies of the progressive left. And the conservative response, I think, is pretty much that Ted Cruz tweet I saw the other day with a bust of Martin Luther King quoting, "I have a dream." It's kind of like, I mean, to me, it's even worse than the bloody Globo Hobo poster. It's the it's like it's not even creating it's just like denying everything. It's denying reality in order to believe in a kind of beautiful fiction world where your country is always good and your government is always best and all the rest of it. I honestly hate them. I've come to hate conservatives more than the left in so many ways. Anyway,
it's kind of an old debate, isn't it? Like Plato raised the same question of the noble lie versus the myth that was believed to be true by his society. So, these questions don't always get answers.
But of course, in that case, the person who was lying was a leader, and he knew that he was lying. The question is, you look at these leading conservatives, and you think, do they know that they're lying, or are they just unwittingly lying? I don't know.
But you see, to me, and this is why I'm having a go at this view that I've seen echoed in the chat throughout this stream, the view that says that we should, because it's ugly, because it's not pleasant, because it's inconvenient, because it doesn't affirm the best of life, we should shrink from all of those civilization is incommunicable tweets I sent out. We should shrink from that and not look at it, because it's much easier to believe in the Martin Luther King version of reality. Is that what you're telling me? I mean, it's just like, I don't understand. Or like, if you were going to make artworks, you wouldn't want to reflect the fact that this is going on. You wouldn't want to look at reality in the face because what? I just don't. I don't get the argument. I don't.
But then retrospectively, why would anyone look at that art? It doesn't tell you anything about the truth of the time. The truth of the time, in some respects, is ugly and is disturbing, and so your art reflects that time. And I know that Francis Bacon used to say that he lived in an era of atrocities, so of course his art had to reflect that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think a great piece of art might be a typical civilization is communicable scene with a bust of Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" right above it. To me, that would be a much more artistic statement than, I don't know, LARPing as Byron in front of a mountain or some bullshit. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Anyway, let's have a look at entropy. Adam E says all good modern architects had received a traditional education. Education today wants you to be like those men, but they refuse to teach you what they taught. Compulsory architecture education is merely a simulation. Narco Republican says modern literature, that colossal reactionary enterprise. Nicholas Gomez de Villa. Years the Eunuch says modern art is a product of the progressive sentiment that's been growing since the Enlightenment, a severance from tradition and nature, replaced by dark dreams of utopia and godless transcendence. Do either of you guys want to react to that?
Yes and no. I mean, in modernism, you have both the anti-Enlightenment counter-reaction, as well as the lies, the utopian lies. So you have two tracks in modernism. I think it would be unfair just to look at the one.
What else have we got? Cheesy Watsit says, what does Alexander think of Graham Sutherland's work, and did his portrait of Churchill have any political significance?
I do like a lot of his work, especially the early work. Graham Sutherland's a very good sort of neo-romantic artist, closely associated with Francis Bacon in the 1940s and early 50s. He painted a portrait of Churchill in around sort of 1949, 1950, which was presented to Churchill, and Churchill said it's a very good example of modern art, which is known as a double-edged compliment. Eventually, he apparently loathed it, and as soon as he died, his widow burnt the painting because it was seen as sort of being disrespectful. Someone said it looked like he was sitting on a lavatory.
Ben Wheeler says, shout out to my RW fiction writer homies, Kosova Magazine, Galaxy's Edge, and Nick Cole, John C. Wright, and Ark Haven, and unauthorized.tv. Keep fighting the good fight. From Pinkerton's Ghosts, they can't touch us. So there we go. The new IKB 4472 says, if you want to paint a dance hall, then paint a bloody dance hall. Simple as. Do you want to respond to that?
I would say that yes, there are plenty of artists who have already painted it. It's a challenge to try and paint it in a new way. You don't lose the old ways; they're still there.
Well, I wonder if, and Alexander, I'm sure you have much more considered things to say about this, that in the age of photography, if that kind of painting, if there is really much of a point to that kind of thing anymore, or if something can, like, if the idea is to reproduce something, that maybe it needs to be stamped with a kind of perspectivity of the creator. I mean, obviously, anything that you paint is going to be kind of created anew, like in your mind as you paint it. And you could paint a scene that has never existed, of course. But I wonder if part of what makes modern art so abstract and so aperspectival is just simply the fact that that photography had already existed by that point. Do you think that there's anything to that?
Yeah, very much. I think a lot of painters were extremely disturbed. Some painter who saw one of the first photographs said that painting is dead, because basically what was painting if it wasn't describing things? And so with the rise of photography, painting had to do something more. You had to do something else. You couldn't just describe. Now, of course, if you use your imagination, you can precisely paint something which is completely fantastic or not there, or you can make subtle changes. So there is a great value to painting descriptively, but yes, it kind of opened the door to painting non-descriptively. So yeah, I mean that's essentially what kick-started abstraction.
I just don't understand though. Where does this idea come from that, in order to be like acceptable to the quote unquote right, art has to be like literalist kind of realism or some bullshit? I just don't like. Okay, let's pretend somebody did a dance hall that was not a kind of simple representation of what a dance hall looks like. I mean, to me, that's where the artistry comes in. I just don't I don't understand why there's this insistence that any deviation from that is bad in some way.
Well, now that I've questioned what the super chat author there has said, let me kind of try and defend them here and say that if the purpose of art is to tell the truth, which is kind of what we've been, I think, leaning towards in our discussion a couple of minutes ago, maybe depicting the world as it is in a photorealistic way even is kind of part of maybe that's more along the lines of what the reactionary should be doing as opposed to the conservative.
Yes, you could have social realism from the right, showing exactly what the impact of our cultural enrichment is.
Yeah, but I mean, to me, I feel like and this is going to sound a bit Brechtian, I suppose, but the idea of making the familiar strange in order to see it as it really is something that I find that sometimes the paint, the artist as painter can do that in a way that the photographer may not be able to. He can draw out. I mean, think of the last monk that we looked at, where I said people said I could see his pain. Well, that may have not come across if it just been like a straight representation of the guy's face. You understand what I'm saying? So I don't know. I feel like these are all techniques that can be used for any political purpose, that they don't necessarily track one way or the other. Restoring Order is just $75. Thanks for that. Machiavelli sucks to go. If that was Patrick Casey, I was listening to him kind of rambling around an airport just before we came on air. So I kind of enjoy the kind of casual nature of spaces where you can jump in and listen for 10 minutes and jump out again. But anyway, Machiavelli Sucks to Go says, how in the hell did John Lennon marry Yoko Ono? Well, that's a topic for another stream, I think. But I mean, Yoko Ono was a modern artist.
Yeah, she was a conceptual artist. Yeah.
Do you rate her at all? Not.
I'm not a big fan of conceptual art, so I couldn't really.
No.
Say.
Machiavelli Sucks to Go also says Germany was correct about art. He also says, "Oh my God, art should inspire us." You see, and again, I mean, this is something I've always felt. I always remember. You're speaking of that English teacher I mentioned earlier on. I got into trouble at one point during my A levels when we were set to Dead Poet Society. Right, we had to write an essay on Dead Poet Society, and I said something like this manipulative film, plunders the history of English literature for carpe diem slogans. It kind of reduces literature to the idea that it should inspire. I mean, this is a fucking child's idea of what art is. I've always bristled against it, even as a teenager. So I don't know, like art should inspire us. Discuss.
Well, yes, but different things can inspire you, and also you can be inspired to do terrible things. So, yeah, there are different routes to inspiration and different routes from inspiration.
Mike, any thoughts? Art should inspire us.
Yeah, it's such a broad statement that it's hard to sort of endorse or not endorse it. Inspire us, as in breathe into us. It should breathe some sort of a feeling into us. Of course, it should make us feel something. But when I read, again, I mentioned a Greek tragedy. When I read something like that, I'm not sure that it really inspires me per se, but it certainly inspires some sort of reaction. It does give me that. It's almost like, and this is going to be a horrifically mundane analogy. It's almost like eating a spicy curry or something, where after it you just feel flushed of everything. I love spicy food, and I eat it almost every day. So when you get something like that's too much to handle, that just you watch, or you could watch a movie like Old Boy or something like that, and at the end of that you just feel drained, but you feel drained in a good way, like a workout is kind of given you. That's a kind of, that makes you feel something. Is that inspiration? I'm not quite sure.
I would typically call what you're describing there, Mike, as catharsis, right?
Yeah.
Catharsis. I mean, the reason I rail against this idea, art should inspire us in quotes, is because I feel like again, it's playing into this idea that you should come away for it kind of with your head held high, ready to face the world or something. I mean, no fucking person in history has ever watched like Hamlet or something like that and come away with that feeling, because it's not. I mean, it's not like life is more complicated than simply. I mean, literature is not a self-help manual. I mean, I'll never forget one of these student complaints that came in once. It wasn't directed on one of my courses, but it was something that came up in one of the meetings, and the student was saying, like, I'm having a lot of problems on this course because, like, these novels are sad. The novels are sad. I mean, what do you do? Like, you understand what I'm saying, right?
Yeah.
I mean, how the hell are you going to finish a literature degree if you can't read stuff that's going to upset you, or stuff that's going to challenge you, or stuff that's, I mean, to me, and this is way beyond like left wing, right wing. This is just like, what is the purpose of art?
Also, I should sort of respond a bit. Although I've been putting the case for the vanguard modernism and so forth, that isn't to say that I'm opposed to traditional art and that I'm opposed to old art. And I've written quite a lot on ancient art and the art of the Renaissance, and I'm about to write on Vermeer once again. And I'm a huge enthusiast for those arts. So don't think that this is sort of like the whole of my taste or the whole of my argument, and that I'm decrying beauty. the possibility of making beautiful work now and the possibility of making beautiful figurative work now. So no, I'm open to different options. So just because I'm arguing one case, that doesn't mean that all my eggs are in one basket.
Yeah, but even having said that, Alexander, you can go back to Renaissance paintings and so on, and they're not all like, life affirming kind of,
you've got the beheading of St. John. You've got crucifixions. Yes, absolutely. You've got
it's full of tragedy and despair.
Absolutely.
But there's something in that. Sorry.
Go on, Mike. Go on. Sorry.
Oh yeah. But there's something in that is kind of life affirming in a way. So I don't read a tragedy to feel bad. I don't listen to a Nick Drake album to want to go commit suicide or something. And I don't look at a painting like Et in Arcadia Ego or something. I don't look at that to get down, right? But there's something about looking at a painting like that, where it's a pastoral Arcadian painting of a beautiful countryside, and the title of the painting means even in Arcadia I am there. So what it's saying is that even in paradise, death is still there. That's not a very nice sentiment, but there's something in that. There's the connection that you make with that, and it's kind of hard to explain, that is just yours. It's something that you have, that when I listen to like an Elliott Smith record, like my favorite record of his is self-titled, there's some, even though it's horribly depressing, it's also mine in a way. If that makes any sense. It's kind of hard to explain, but just for that 40 minutes, there's something, I enter into his world, and it's something that is possessed by me. And at the end of it, I don't feel depressed. I feel in some way kind of empowered. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I get this feeling when I listen to harsh or difficult music quite a lot, is that there's something that it's something possessed by me, and that does give me a kind of strength.
Yeah, and I would say that don't mistake ugliness, which comes from a person feeling ugly and acting in an ugly way in order to brutalize and to humiliate you and to degrade your culture. Don't confuse that with the vitalism, which is essential, which comes through in a way that is raw and sometimes ugly, but is also life-affirming. You have to be able to differentiate between those.
Mm. Yes, I don't know. I understand what Mike is talking about as well. I have certain albums where when I put it on, I often feel like I'm the only person in the world listening to it, something like that. And in fact, my next AA radio, which is going to be on Sunday, is all about melancholic singer-songwriters. So maybe we'll see a bit of Nick Drake in there, copyright pending, of course. For some reason, I've got a feeling that Nick Drake may be copyright heavy, but we'll see. All right, that's all. Thank you very much, everybody. Just to remind people, Alexander, where can people find you? Do you have anything?
They can find me on Twitter at AdamsArtist. So they're welcome to follow me there. But best place to follow my reading and my thoughts is alexanderadamsart.substack.com. And
Mike?
You can find my work and the work of many other great artists at imperiumpress.org. If you want to read my thoughts on the radical right as well as political theory, it's imperiumpress.substack.com. And if you want to hear some podcasts by myself, you can go to imperiumpress.gumroad.com.
I just remind people, do buy courses at the academic agency. That is the main thing that helps me out here. But like and subscribe. Thanks for all your help. But most importantly of all, get out.
What goes on in this town is none of your business.
As long as I'm living here, it is.
Then maybe you shouldn't be living here!
Well, that's easily fixed.